Hello, and welcome to the 2020 Royal Institute of Philosophy Cardiff Annual Lecture. My name is Jonathan Webber, and I'm Head of Philosophy at Cardiff University. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. Havi Carel is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Bristol, where she teaches philosophy to both philosophy students and to medical students. She is well known for her distinctive philosophical work, where she brings the insights and concepts of 20th century European phenomenology to bear on the concepts of health and illness and disease. Her book, Illness, published in 2008, was shortlisted for the Wellcome Book Prize and is now reprinted in its third edition. Havi is also the author of academic monographs, most recently Phenomenology of Illness, published by Oxford University Press, and she has published papers in medical journals such as the Lancet and the British Medical Journal, as well as in philosophy journals such as the Journal of Applied Philosophy and the Journal of European Philosophy. This evening she will turn her distinctive phenomenological perspective onto investigating that most pervasive of 2020 phenomena, social distancing. Before she starts, I'd like to invite you to contribute to this evening's discussion. So somewhere on your screen, depending on which kind of device you're watching on, there is a chat function on YouTube. And if you have any questions for our speaker this evening, I'd like you to type those into the chat, please, as you think of them. And as the talk goes on, we will work through selecting questions which Havi will then answer after the talk. Okay, good. Well, I hope you all have a good evening. And without any further ado, Havi.
Hi, good evening everybody, and thank you so much to Jonathan Webber and Julian Bagini for inviting me. I am delighted to be giving the RIP lecture at the University of Cardiff today, and I'm going to talk about possibly what's on everybody's mind more than anything else these days, the pandemic. And I'll try and utilize some tools from philosophy in order to see what is philosophically interesting or valuable in the pandemic. What can we learn from it as philosophers or as people are interested in philosophy? So I'll start with a true story about my 7-year-old son who, in the height of lockdown, was invited to lots of sort of Zoom events. I organized a class Zoom meeting, and he would Zoom with friends, and the parents would continuously say, "Oh, do you want to Zoom with Billy, or do you want to Zoom with Martin?" And one time he just turned to me and refusing to go on Zoom, and he said, "What's the point if I can't touch them?" He said it with lots of anger. He said it with lots of passion, and it made me really think there is something that is entirely intangible and frustrating and unfulfilling about trying to have a play date on Zoom. And interestingly, we use or can use these kinds of insights that might seem small or mundane or trivial in order to look at the pandemic and think, what's interesting and valuable about it is that it sheds new light on things we've previously taken for granted. And what I'm going to do tonight is try and think of a framework, a philosophical framework that would enable us to look at these things that we have taken for granted and use them to try and understand not only how pandemic conditions have changed how we live, but also why and how we lived as we did previously. In the broadest terms, we can think about ourselves as a being in the world or beings in the world. And this idea really captures the entire way in which we connect with our environment, connect with other people, relate to things outside ourselves, our entire connection to the world. And the claim I'm going to make tonight is that these pandemic conditions have really shifted and profoundly changed how we are in the world. They've certainly changed the ways in which we can be with other people. These two terms are taken from the German 20th century philosopher Martin Heidegger, and I will come back to them in more detail in the talk. But what I'd like to propose is that such a huge shift in our entire way of being in the world, our entire way of being with other people, is of course upsetting and profoundly distressing to many people, has impacted on all of us in negative and disturbing ways. But it is also a philosophical opportunity. It is also a chance for us to consider how and why the way in which we live can shape who we are. And there's an interesting analogy to the case of illness, which I've written on in the past, using these very same terms. One of the claims I made in my work on illness is that illness, as a disruption of our lived experience, as a disruption of our everyday routines and habits, can create this kind of philosophical opportunity to examine those habits. And the person you see on the slide is the French author Jean-Dominique Bauby, who some of you may have come across through his memoir, The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, or the film made based on that memoir. Jean-Dominique Bauby suffered a catastrophic stroke and brain hemorrhaging, which resulted in him changing from the man you see at the bottom with his two young children to somebody who suffers from locked-in syndrome. As suffering from locked-in syndrome, Bauby was unable to move any part of his body other than his left eyelid, which through blinking he used to communicate with the world. If you read The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, you can see how this dramatic change in his embodiment actually served as a philosophical opportunity for him to examine how and why he lived as he did previously, how the terms of his embodiment have changed his life, his identity, his sense of self, his agency. And more broadly, what I want to do is try and take this particular idea that illness, pathology, aberration, disruption, profoundly disturbing though they are also a philosophical opportunity for us to examine how things go normally. So it's very interesting, I think, to try and think of cases of illness, accident, trauma, and of course also the global disruption we're experiencing now in the pandemic as such a philosophical opportunity, where profound changes to our embodiment determine and constrict or subscribe the kinds of ways in which we are able to live. So what I hope to do in this talk is to make good on what I've just said. I'll start by briefly outlining my approach, and I'm going to draw on two philosophical traditions and ideas here for my analysis. The first is Phenomenology, which is the philosophical tradition started with Edmund Husserl, later on Martin Heidegger, Maurice Merleau-Ponty in the French and German tradition of 20th century philosophy. And I'll explain what phenomenology means very roughly. And I'll also draw on contemporary philosopher Laurie Paul's idea of transformative experience. And after briefly outlining these theoretical approaches, I'm going to offer a pandemic transformative phenomenology, saying that these two methodologies, these two ideas, that of phenomenology, of the examination of our lived experience, and that of transformative experience, jointly will help us make sense of the philosophical aspects. It will help us philosophize about the pandemic. There will be also a conclusion in which I will say some things about the uses or the possible uses of adversity of the kind we are experiencing now in our philosophizing. So, very, very briefly, phenomenology is part of a philosophical tradition that aims to make explicit the subtle structures of experience. So this will help us pinpoint some elements of our everyday, taken for granted, habitual routines, habits, modes of interaction that have been disrupted by the pandemic. And these are aspects of experience that are so deeply rooted in our lives that we tend to typically overlook them. They are the broad aspects of our existence that give us the context within which we have social interactions, the shared world we find ourselves in when we encounter other people and other things, the way in which we experience ourselves as beings in the world, as I started out by saying. Moving on to this idea of transformative experience. So this is a quote from the beginning of Paul's 2014 book. She says, "When you find yourself facing a decision involving a new experience that is unlike any other experience you've had before, you can find yourself in a special kind of epistemic situation. You know very little about your possible future. These big decisions involve choices to have experiences that teach us things we cannot know from any source but the experience itself." And Paul labels these kinds of experiences transformative experience. So these are experiences that change who we are, but we don't know what they're going to be like prior to having them. I'll continue with the quotation and then I'll explain what Paul means exactly by transformative experience. So, she says, many of these new and unknown experiences are life-changing or dramatically personally transformative. We only learn what we need to know after we've done it, and we change ourselves in the process of doing it. So I hope you can start seeing how this is going to be very relevant to our thinking about the pandemic as a set of new and unknown experiences that are life-changing and sometimes dramatically personally transformative. So let me just explain a little bit more what Paul means by transformative experience. Well, she says, consider the following question. A couple, a man and a woman, to keep it simple, sit down and discuss whether they should start a family, whether they should try for a baby. And they're trying to make a rational decision, a rational choice. So they sit and they make a list of all the pros and cons of might be involved in this. Now the problem for Paul is that you can't know in advance when you consider something like becoming a parent. You can't tell in advance whether how it's going to pan out for you specifically. You don't know what the experience is like. So she says, what characterizes transformative experiences is that they epistemically transform us. Epistemically, in the sense that they give us new knowledge. So they transform what we know. So prior to being parents, we might have, seen some films or read some books about parenting. But that, says Paul, won't give us the information we need, namely, what it is going to be like for me. What is it going to be like for me specifically to be a parent to this particular child? So none of the theoretical or objective information I could read about in psychological studies or books would give me that information. So there's an entirely new knowledge that I cannot get in any other way other than through having the experience. And you can start seeing the problem. The problem, says Paul, is that I don't know if I want the experience because I don't know what it's going to be like. So I can't make the decision. I don't have full knowledge in order to make that rational decision. So a transformative experience is one that is epistemically transformative. It gives us new knowledge that we could not acquire otherwise. In this case, the knowledge what it would be like to hold my baby in my arms for the first time, and so on. Transformative experiences are also personally transformative in the sense that once we've undergone them, we have new values, new expectations, new preferences, And again, continuing with the parenting example, Paul says, well, prior to becoming a parent, I thought that getting 8 hours of solid sleep a night was absolutely top value for me. I really valued that. It was really important. I cherished my sleep. After becoming a parent, I've just realized I can get by just fine on 5 or 6 hours punctuated with night wakings and so on. So my values have changed. It could be that prior to becoming a parent, I really valued seeing my friends a lot, or traveling, or having lots of time to read. And then once I've become a parent, I value other things, spending time with my baby, reading up on child psychology and so on. So the other element of transformative experience is that it personally transforms us, in the sense that it gives us new preferences and values, and we don't know what these are going to be like prior to having had that transformative experience. So, says Paul, we're in a bit of a pickle when it comes to trying to make rational choices about things like deciding whether to have a baby, namely because they are transformative experiences. Now, what I want to propose here, to get back to the much less cheerful topic of the pandemic, is that the pandemic experience is this kind of experience. It is transformative. It's epistemically transformative in that it gave us new knowledge about what it's like to live in the age of a global pandemic, something none of us had much of a clue about until a few months ago. And it's potentially also personally transformative in that new values and preferences have emerged throughout things like lockdown, new ways of socializing and so on. So moving on to the next part of the talk, now I'm going to try and use these two tools, the phenomenological approach and this conception of transformative experience, in order to try and articulate what a pandemic phenomenology might look like. So going back to phenomenology, we can see that when we think about how we interact with other people, that has been profoundly modified, changed, disrupted, regimented by what we now call social distancing. So the immediacy with which you recognize others as fellow subjects of experience, and the natural and taken for granted or automatic way in which you interact with other people, has been radically disrupted in our shared experiences of social distancing. Now, if you think about it, of course, not all our interactions with other people have been positive ones prior to the pandemic. But what the pandemic shows us is that the extent to which interactions with other people can either nurture a sense of comfort and hope, or a feeling of discomfort and vulnerability. And of course, what happened in the pandemic is that our social experiences have shifted much more towards these the negative side of the spectrum of feeling discomfort and vulnerability. And if you look at these images, there have been lots of, don't come near, limit contact, stay 6 feet apart, and so on. These very strong messages of needing to regiment, control, override our natural way of interacting with other people due to the pandemic. We can add to that also a very profound sense of isolation, of thinking of other people as sources of danger or risk. Going into a supermarket or standing in a queue have now become profoundly stressful experiences. So when we consider ourselves as these embodied creatures, or are used to interact with other people, tapping them, touching them on the arm, patting their backs, giving them a hug, or even just the way in which we naturally stand quite close to each other when we're speaking. And all of a sudden, we see things like these images you're seeing in the slide of people standing in their own circle, or people standing on particular marked spots when they're queuing. And I don't know if you've noticed this, but something I've seen over and over again is that in the queues, people kind of tend to bunch up as time progresses, as the queuing progresses, partly because they're impatient, but partly also because our natural standing distance from each other is much smaller than 6 feet. it might be a foot or a foot and a half. So the artificial way in which our embodied being with others has been modified has certainly given rise to very negative sensations, feelings, thoughts, emotions that people have had. Isolation, great rise in people reporting mental ill health, huge increase in anxiety, partly because of fears about one's own health and what's going to happen to them, others, loved ones, relatives, financial worries, worries about the future, a sense of uncertainty, and of course the very, very profound loneliness that this physical barrier between us and other people, this need to keep 6 feet apart, the restrictions on socializing, on having people come round, meeting in the pub, all of these have hugely increased the sense of loneliness people are experiencing. So we can phenomenologically think about that sense of loneliness as what happened when this very natural and naturally flowing sense of being with other people as an embodied experience has become so regimented and imbued with fear and anxiety about contagion. If you compare the two images, the one at the top showing how kids would normally play, and the one at the bottom showing how they are now interacting, spending time with each other in shared spaces in a way that's exactly, regimented, isolating, separated, you can see that what happened in the pandemic is that our interpersonal relations have suddenly become very, very salient because this very natural previous mode of interaction has been disrupted. Now, the very natural mode of interaction was previously taken for granted, and this, I think, illustrates the point I was making at the beginning, which is that when we consider the pandemic, we don't just see the disruption, we can also go back and see how the undisrupted, taken for granted normal way of doing things was. Even if previously it was entirely transparent, something that was in the background, something that we weren't really considering at all. I think a lot of us never turned our attention to questions about how far should you stand from other people until the pandemic forced us to consider relating to other people as something that is profoundly dangerous. Think about other people's as a form of risk, if you like. Now, this is one example of how this pandemic phenomenology might be developed. We can look at everyday practices or micro practices of very small things, where you sit, where you stand, how you talk to other people, how do you see your friends. And we might say, well, this is a very kind of stable aspect of human life, this social engagement. And it may be that it is. But phenomenology is not just interested in the aspects of human experience that are invariant, such as, social expectations or social norms about embodied interaction with other people. It's also important to note that phenomenology can be very sensitive to differences. And in fact, a cross-cultural phenomenology might actually be very illuminating in revealing to us which aspects of human experience are invariant across backgrounds and cultures, and where differences lie. And of course, much has been said, and there is this huge significance that we can all see when we look at inequities and differences in healthcare systems, political systems, the ways in which different countries responded to the pandemic, and of course, the health, racial and social inequities, and how these give rise to really profoundly different pandemic experiences. So phenomenology doesn't aim to flatten those differences, but actually to give us a tool through which we can create a taxonomy of similarities and differences, looking both at the shared aspects of the pandemic experience, but also at the ways in which it is different given all these different factors. So, carrying on with thinking about the experience of social distancing, what we had previously, and what phenomenology tells us we have, is that we exist as embedded in a pre-given world. And that embeddedness provides us also with a very rich background of norms that we use for interacting with other people. So if you think about going to a cafe or a pub in the evening, there are a lot of norms that were taken for granted, that you stand at a certain distance from other people, that you go up to the bar to order your drinks, that you sit at your table, but you can get up and walk to the bar or the toilet or whatever. And of course that you can speak to other people freely. And if you think about all of this background structure, this background information, it has really been changed and again artificially modified by the pandemic, by social distancing. So this background that gave us all this certainty and knowledge about how to navigate ourselves in the world has now been replaced by a series of external, medically or scientifically driven edicts about how we should behave with other people. So the norms of interaction that were once taken for granted are gone. And for a brief period, I'll give an example in a minute, we had a real kind of hiatus in that people weren't sure. Can I talk to you? Can I come up to you? Do you want to meet in the pub or in the park? These kinds of questions suddenly arose for interactions that, again, were very, very mundane and transparent and taken for granted in the past. So here is an example of how we moved from the handshake norm to the elbow bump. And if you think about it, it was only a few months ago when you met somebody new, you would stretch out your hand and shake their hand, say, nice to meet you. And that was considered the right thing to do in many contexts, not all, but many. When COVID started, there was lots of discussions and reports in the news and social media about who shook hands and who refused to shake hands and so on. And there was a real period, as you can see in these images, we've got Angela Merkel offering her hand to the German Minister of Interior and him saying no. And similarly, the Australian Tony Morrison offering his hand to the New South Wales Premier, who's withdrawing, saying, what are you doing? So we can see that there was a period where the handshake was no longer feasible as an acceptable norm, but nothing came in to replace it. And then very quickly we got our elbow bump, and now we're on kind of safe ground again. Now elbow bumps have become, the new friendly gesture of the everyday, which, I've seen my son's rugby coach doing elbow bumps, and when you meet new people, it's a kind of nice icebreaker. So we can really look at this example and say what this kind of study can help us see is how we have moved, or how the accumulation of these kinds of small or even micro practices, you might call them, can have this accumulative character and ultimately give rise to a much broader global sense of uncertainty. So the handshake to elbow bump is an example of one micro practice that has been disrupted and reinvented as the elbow bump. But we can also think of a multitude of other micro practices, all of which have been disrupted. Chatting to other parents at drop-off. Are you still allowed to do that? Using masks, where, who, how much, and expectations about how we interact with people in every setting. Home life, can we have friends over? How many friends can we have over? Can we meet in the park? Can we meet in the pub? Workplace arrangements, school and educational settings, healthcare appointments. Everything has been thrown up into the air. So all of these known and accepted micro practices, such as the handshake, have just become no longer acceptable or dangerous. And what we're doing now is we are in the process of replacing these with new micro practices that can re-anchor us in the world. But of course, in this hiatus, there is a huge sense of uncertainty that is triggered by these micro practices no longer being acceptable. And this may mean that what we need to do now is do a micro phenomenology of the sort I've just offered you, of thinking, how did we go from the handshake to the elbow bump? What was lost and gained in the process of doing that? And I want to offer this idea of global uncertainty as a way of characterizing the loss of what was once this sort of pre-reflective, automatic, taken for granted sense of trust we had relating to most things in our lives. So that trust, that sense of certainty, has been replaced by a sense of doubt, uncertainty, loss of trust, not in just one area of life, but across a host of life domains, habits, routines, practices that are simply no longer tenable in the post-pandemic world we live in. So looking more closely at this idea of global uncertainty, what we might say about global uncertainty is that this dismantling of the everyday inevitably must lead to a pervasive breakdown of habits of the sort I was just describing. So the loss of norms, routines, and structure of our everyday alters our sense of temporal passage, alters our sense of being with other people, alters our sense of self, alters our sense of ourselves as securely embedded in a known, a predictable world. This has all gone up into the air, this kind of analysis tells us. Now, going back to this idea of being with, you might say, well, if embodied interaction with others is this essential foundation of human experience, such as I was making the case it is, then of course this unprecedented disruption of all levels of interaction is very likely to have a globally destabilizing effect. So the global uncertainty emerging from this cumulative effect of the changed micro practices, the loss of routines and norms, the radical changes to the structure of our everyday, where every single thing that makes up that everyday, how we go to work, how we are at work, how we do our shopping, how we school our children, all of this cumulatively amounts to this sense of mounting, stressful, anxiety-inducing, philosophically exciting and disturbing and interesting sense of global uncertainty. And this destabilization and the extent to which it has reached into our everyday and dismantled our given practices is something very much worthy of philosophical consideration. Now, it is not all bad. So you might say, everything I've said so far has been really negative. It's all about dismantling, destabilizing, disrupting. What about the positive effects of pandemic? Now, of course, we can easily enumerate lots of these. People had a sense of solidarity, of being brought together. People have maybe more time to rekindle friendships. There are fewer distractions, or at least were during lockdown. People on social media, there were lots and lots of reports of people taking up new hobbies, a strong sense of solidarity we saw in various initiatives people have organized to help those who are more vulnerable in the pandemic. Lots of expressions of gratitude, which you might have different opinions on, but there was certainly a lot of that going on. And a lot of people have actually commented on how changes to their everyday, restrictive though they are, actually had positive effects. So for example, working from home has repeatedly been flagged up as much less stressful and much more efficient than coming into work every day, cutting out the commute. I've seen lots of posts on social media, I'm sure you have as well, where people say, oh, maybe I don't need to get 2 takeaway lattes every day. Maybe I don't need to do as much shopping as I did previously. Maybe I don't need so many clothes. So the changes to really fundamental life patterns, some of them have been opportunities to, reconsider, reawaken various concerns such as environmental concerns, concerns about consumerism, and to try and live better in some sense of the word. So there have been some positive effects. Of course, there have been a multitude of negative effects, and I've spoken about those a lot. So I think I won't say much more other than saying there has been tremendously negative effects of the pandemic of this kind. What I'm trying to point to here is that the experience is not monolithically negative, but has a richness and a nuance to it that is important to mine and explore. Okay, so going back to the question about transformation, we can now go back and ask what kind of transformative experience is the pandemic. And before we consider whether it is a transformative experience, we should very strongly emphasize that the example I gave earlier when I was describing Paul's work had to do with choosing or making a choice or making a decision about whether to have a child. Now, of course, none of us chose to have the pandemic or to have pandemic transformative experiences. So it's important to remember that transformative experiences don't have to be voluntary things like choosing to have a child, choosing to go traveling. They can also be, the transformative experiences can also arise from experiences that are foisted upon us, for example, the pandemic. And I think in what I've said so far, we can find strong evidence that pandemic experiences have transformed us. It transformed us personally because the experience of pandemic and lockdown for a lot of people, maybe for most of us, certainly for me, have changed our values and preferences in really deep ways. So one example that has been discussed a lot in the media was this awakened appreciation we've now gotten through the lockdown and the closure of the schools, this appreciation of state school system and how important it is for children's well-being, for children's social lives, for children's global development, not just the place where you go to learn how to read and write, but schools being such a fundamental edifice in our civic life together. There's certainly been a lot of talk of how much less we can consume. That has maybe changed people's habits. There's been people saying, well, why do I need a new dress, or why do I need high heels if I'm not going out anyway? But also more seriously, people posing very interesting questions that I've seen a lot of on social media. Why do I need to wear a different outfit every day? Why do I need this many pairs of shoes? And of course, the way in which people reconsider the things they may have thought were absolutely essential for their well-being, say an exotic holiday during Christmas. Now people are thinking, how can I make Christmas work for me without needing to go anywhere? So this kind of reconsideration of our habits also contributes to this personal transformation that I'm pointing to. Really importantly in all of this, I think there's been a real sense of environmental activists and others that this is a once in a lifetime opportunity for us to hit the pause button on the environmental catastrophe we all live in by taking precisely these kinds of insights. Do I need those new shoes? Do I need to fly here and there for my holiday, and harnessing them to changing the way in which we live, not just in response to the current pandemic, but as a long-term change. So I think it would be fair to say that the pandemic has personally transformed many of us in the sense that our values and preferences and choices we make have really changed as a result of the pandemic. Thinking about the epistemic transformation, I think this is an easy case to make, because previously we did not know what it is like to live in a global pandemic. And now that we've had that experience, we know what it is like, and this new knowledge could not have been acquired otherwise. None of the fictional portrayals of a pandemic world have even come close to the kinds of stuff we're living with now. It has really brought to us with dizzying detail this incredible amounts of new knowledge that we've all acquired over the past few months in a very short space of time. So, has the pandemic transformed us? I think undoubtedly the answer to that is yes. We have undergone what might one day be termed a collective trauma. We went through lockdown. We thought it was going to be only a few weeks, only a few months. Now it's clear to us that the disruption is profound, long-lasting. We have no end in sight at the moment. And as I said, it's also given us this opportunity to hit the pause button, not just on environmental concerns, questions about consumption, how much we drive, how much we fly, but also to hit the pause button more existentially, if you like, on how we live. And to give us this opportunity to reconsider our values precisely in the transformative way that Paul talks about transformative experiences. These are experiences that change our values, that give us new knowledge, and through that change who we are. And most deeply, I think, this disorienting sense of how fragile our identity is and how fragile our sense of how to live is, and how it's all been crumpled, if you like, and very, very quickly and sometimes roughly reconstructed. That disorienting sense of fragility is one that we have gained from the pandemic. It's a new insight, it's a new kind of knowledge and acknowledgement that we can take from this pandemic and how it's transformed us. Now, this recognition that we are vulnerable to radical types of transformative experiences, such as the pandemic, this recognition of our vulnerabilities is something that is very hard for us to accept and to get our heads around and to acknowledge. But I want to end by pointing to the potential positive aspects of that confrontation of our vulnerability to the radical ways in which the world might change us and foist new experiences on us, experiences none of us would have chosen, but that are nonetheless radically transformative. So I will end with Shakespeare, who in a famous passage from As You Like It says, "Sweet are the uses of adversity, which like the toad, ugly and venomous, wears yet a precious jewel in his head." So how can we distill, study, philosophize about, understand the sweet uses of adversity? So I'll just conclude by saying a few things about this. The first is that we cannot avoid adversity. What the pandemic has given us is a very profound sense of our vulnerability, our fragility, our susceptibility to chance, to historical events, to the unfolding of things much greater than us. And we cannot avoid that adversity. On the other hand, we can also productively use this knowledge to consider the ways in which adversity can be useful, positive, productive, in the ways I've just enumerated. Can we live differently now? Can we live better now? Can we do things better now? Through the knowledge that this adverse experience of the pandemic has given us. We also might want to think about how changes to practices and micro-practices, changes to mundane elements of the everyday, can have this profound, overarching, cumulative effect that leads to a global sense of uncertainty. You could say, oh, does it really matter if I shake hands or elbow bump? No. But as we've seen throughout this talk, I tried to make the case that the micro practices actually are profoundly significant because they underpin, they girdle, they provide the background to our everyday activities, behaviors, thoughts, actions, and in that sense are absolutely essential for our ability to conduct a life, if you like. So finally, the last idea of conveyed in the talk is that we need to really be attentive to these small and seemingly trivial things that actually are much more philosophically significant than we normally take them to be. So amplifying, inspecting, philosophically studying the small, the mundane and the trivial can lead us to much broader philosophical insights. So thank you so much for listening to the talk. And before I finish, I will just thank my collaborators on this work. So some of this work has been carried out with collaborators on the Experiences of Social Distancing project, and these are Matthew Broom, Clara Hampston, Alice Malpass, Tomoari Mori, Matthew Radcliffe, and Federico Sangatti. And the work on the thinking about the pandemic as a transformative experience is joint work I've done with the philosopher Ian James Kidd from Nottingham. I've put some of the publications on which the talk was based up here for you to look at. And then finally, this idea that phenomenology can be a useful, productive way for us to study our everyday lives and study our embodiment is an idea that's very dear to my heart and that I've written about in relation to illness in the two books, which you see before yourselves. So although there may not seem on the face of it to be much connection between the pandemic and experiences of illness, I'll go back to the insight with which I opened the talk, this idea that changes to the way in which we live as embodied creatures with other beings in the world are profoundly determinative, profoundly disclosive, profoundly important for us to study. And I hope this talk is a first step on the way to doing more of that. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you very much, Havi, and thank you to everybody who has been watching and has asked questions. I've got a nice set of questions here for you, Havi, from people. People are watching all over the world, from all continents, it seems, or maybe not all continents. I don't know if there's anyone here from Antarctica. If there is, say hi in the chat. But before moving to those questions, Javi, there was something I wanted to ask you, actually, if I may abuse my position for a moment. So you've put a lot of emphasis on social distancing, and I was wondering if you thought that there were any aspects of the pandemic that could be understood as, in a way, doing the opposite. I don't know what that would be called, maybe social nearing or proximatizing or something. And I have in mind things like this, but also use of more kind of individual video calling, on Zoom or Skype or whatever. I mean, that's technology that's been around for nearly 20 years, but lots of people didn't really use it very much until recently. There were only a very few people I knew who I could call on those kind of devices, and it always seemed a little bit weird and a little bit awkward for those of us who didn't do it very often. Whereas now, it seems very normal after a few months of the pandemic, and many of us, make those kind of calls all the time as part of our work lives and part of our social lives. So I was wondering whether you thought that kind of social nearing, if that's what it should be called, is itself a kind of change in the structure of what you called our being with, right? Of the structure of our being in the world with one another, particularly since it seems that without that technology, our being with is constrained by spatial location, right? But with that technology, it seems that our being with transcends that spatial our spatial location. So is that a profound change in our being? Do you think?
Thanks, John. Um, I think one important thing to remember about Heidegger's notion of being with is that it's a structure. It's empty, and you can be with other people in positive ways and negative ways. What you were saying about proximity and the use of technology, I think, has two sides to it. On the one hand, the proximatizing, as you called it, I like that word. Um, that has been made possible by technology. On the other hand, the sustained sense of dissatisfaction that people have, that this is not the real thing. So I think ultimately we can use technology to interact, but we have to bear in mind that that interaction is disembodied in the sense that we're not really sharing a space with other people, and it has these profound limitations. We also have other artificial aspects to it. For example, seeing ourselves as we're speaking the whole time is extremely unnatural. We don't monitor our facial features and expressions in a normal conversation, but we do that all the time because we see ourselves in that little box on Zoom. So I think going back to this idea that it's not the same. If you look at small children, for example, young children, they get almost nothing out of an online interaction. We use it, but I think with a very profound sense that it's the lesser evil. It's all we can manage at the moment, but it is not at all like the unmediated being in the same space with somebody else. And I don't think I think technology is useful for, say, conveying verbal information, as we've seen with things like online teaching, for example. But it doesn't include the shared space, the intimate gestures, smelling, touching, feeling other people, something that is so profound to our social communication. So I would say, on the whole, I would say we've lost a lot more than we gained.
Great, thank you. In that, well, I don't know if it is great, but thank you for your reply. And it brings us on to a question from Inez Hippolito, I think, which I think should be appearing on your screen. There you go. So Inez says, "Thank you, great talk. Do you think that the personal transformation as a result of the pandemic necessarily involves a risk to mental health?"
I think that big changes often do, upend a lot of certainties, as I was saying in the talk. I think that sense of global uncertainty, the disruption to a lot of our micro practices, and of course the very real existential anxiety people feel about, what if I get COVID? What if I get bad COVID? What if I get long COVID? What if it kills me? These have had, I think, a very intense cumulative effect, and we've only just finished phase one. We don't know how this will unfold. And in our darkest moments, I'm sure a lot of people like me sit and think, what if this just goes on until the end of my natural life? And I'm just never able, we are never able as individuals and as societies to pick up and reestablish ways of being with other people as they were. I think the risk it's not just a risk. I think our collective and individual mental health has suffered tremendously from the upheaval, the uncertainty, and the sense that this could go on indefinitely, and everything seems like a trade-off with a kind of lose-lose outcome almost. So I would say yes, mental health has been very much affected. The question whether these are natural responses or pathological responses, well, I mean, in a way, to say, oh, it's very natural to feel anxious in the face of great uncertainty isn't enormously helpful, because we still all need a lot more help, and some people profoundly more help with their well-being and mental health.
Right, thank you. I mean, that kind of leads us to another question, which is again perhaps a little more upbeat and positive. And this is a question from Poppy Blofeld. Poppy is a big fan of my shirt. Thank you, Poppy. So am I. But that's not in this comment. In this comment, Poppy asks whether you have anything to say about the curious sense of larger-than-life camaraderie and we're all in this togetherness experienced by a lot of us during the lockdown, which she describes as a warm feeling.
Well, again, I mean, I think this is more of a kind of sociological question, perhaps, but um, a lot of people's spontaneous response to the pandemic initially was, how can I help? What can I do? And very quickly we saw people and groups kind of self-organizing to help vulnerable people, to do food deliveries, whatever. That is certainly one set of responses. We've also seen a lot of other stuff, right? People getting into fights over the last packet of pasta in the supermarket. So I think, you know, you can put a misanthropic or a, you know, humanity loving interpretation on it as you like. I think what we are actually seeing is the full gamut of responses. It is true that in times of distress, people very naturally try and find meaning or find certain repose in the possibility of taking action and helping other people and responding rather than feeling very passive in it. That's certainly part of it. There was certainly, as I said in the talk, an enormous acknowledgement of some of these structures of life that were previously taken for granted. The NHS, schools, the people who drive our buses and supermarket cashiers. And that was a really interesting and positive thing to see, I think. Whether there are more cynical or other interpretations looking at it, I think that's also worth reviewing. But I think it's a very natural reaction to want to come together with other people in times of distress and uncertainty.
So that, I think, leads us quite nicely on to a question from Ahmed Hamad, which is about aesthetic experience and the arts more broadly. So Ahmed wants to ask, to what extent does this global uncertainty affect our aesthetic experience? Many forms of arts, of course, are cherished in gatherings, right? Music concerts, poetry recitation sessions, and there are obviously many more examples. So how is our kind of aesthetic dimension of our life going to be altered by this pandemic, do you think?
Oh, thanks. That's a really interesting comment. I think the performing arts are one of the worst hit sectors, of course, as we've all seen. Whether and how to compensate, create new ways of doing stuff, whether all of this is possible, it remains to be seen. I know people. I've got a friend who's a jazz musician, and she's performing on Facebook. There's all kinds of ways in which we try and make up for the kind of lost sense of certainty. So the question is this, the question is, will we be able to go back, or is going back not even an option? And I think that will very much determine what will happen to life in general, including the performing arts or aesthetic experiences, as you called it. So I think some things are just so profoundly social experiences that there will not be a way to make up for them. So, for example, choir singing, which was huge all across the UK and globally, of course, to to be able to come together with other people in a confined space and sing together that's not going to happen anytime soon. And if you think about something like choir singing, what is it about singing together with other people? Well, it's hearing your voice blending in with the harmony and feeling that special feeling of singing with other people. That can't be recreated on Zoom, I don't think. So what will happen, I think, is once at some point we will have to decide whether we are holding our breath or pausing, as it were, until things can resume and we get back to business as usual, or whether we have to just rethink things in a much more profound way, which is something that might happen to things like the performing arts.
Great, thank you for that interesting reflection on the role of the arts and the kind of embodied aspect of performance and the arts. I've got a question here from famous author Julian Baggini, who would like to know. I guess this is a question about replacing handshakes with elbow bumps, that sort of thing. Do you think that those kind of micro practices which have evolved organically can be effectively replaced by ones that are consciously chosen and designed? Are there any losses in that change? Are there any gains to be had by replacing the kind of haphazard evolved ways of doing things with consciously chosen ones?
Well, thanks, Julian. I think these are really kind of enormous questions that not just for you'll need a lot more than a philosopher to answer these kinds of questions. But I think what will happen is there will be a sort of feedback between the social distancing rules and how things will naturally evolve. So I don't even know who came up with the elbow bump. But one organic change that came out of social distancing is that there's a new game kids play, and it's called coronavirus tag. And the way you play it is one child runs up to the other one and says, you've got coronavirus. And then that person, the infected person, has to chase the other kids and infect them as well. That's a brand new game. That's only been around for a few months. And that's children kind of very naturally taking up, something that's consuming the public life and their family life and doing something with it. So I think we'll probably see a lot of kinds of innovations to our micro practices in that sense. I am less convinced that we will be able to effectively replace some things that just require people to be in the same room, like listening to live music together, to go back to the previous question. What have we lost? What have we gained? I mean, in a way, things are always a little bit regulated. You can't kiss strangers. You can't, I don't know, there's lots of things you can't do on public transport and so on. So, and the norms, I guess they're sort of a blend. They might be regulated by some legal framework, by informal norms. And that kind of blend, I think, will continue to see the same thing. What we're seeing, I think, with the social distancing is that the natural flow, let's meet up in the pub in half an hour, is kind of gone. And all of a sudden you arrange something, but then you say, oh no, but then we're going to be 7, so we can't do it. So somebody has to stay out or whatever. I think these things have just made us very aware of stuff in a way that we weren't before. So one possible positive that I think we also see in cases of illness and disability, where you fall ill or you become disabled, and then you start thinking, oh, so how am I supposed to get my shopping done? How am I supposed to go on holiday? The explicitness has the advantage of laying itself out to us as a form of, or an invitation, if you like, for philosophical reflection. And that's exactly the same kind of methodology I was trying to use here, to say, look, the pandemic happened. Let's try and use it to ask ourselves how we lived up until now, how we're going to live in the future, what's changed. And I think it's valuable in the sense that it invites us to reflect.
Thank you. Yeah, we had a question that was on exactly that topic, which is from Paul Fletcher. I don't know if that one's... Yeah, there we go. Thank you. So Paul asks, I mean, in exactly this kind of Heideggerian theme, really, would you say the pandemic, such as the one we're in, makes us aware of the nail and the hammer? I guess that's an allusion to Heidegger's thought that when the tools are working as they should, you don't really notice them. You know, you just use them, and you only inspect them and their structure and their when they break and when something goes wrong. And I guess that's what Paul's getting at there. So he says, are we consciously more closer to ourselves and others by being further apart?
Oh, so I think there's two things here. I mean, the one, this idea of the breakdown of the tool, making us pay attention to the tool. I think that's exactly the model of the pathological illuminating the normal that I'm interested in. So what we see here is that we have social conventions, which, you know, could be seen as sort of tools, and loosely speaking, and then all of a sudden they're not fit for purpose anymore. So we need to turn our attention to, so how far should I stand from other people, and how many people can I go to a restaurant with, and you know, all that stuff. So it is certainly very useful, again, as a reflective experience. I mean, Heidegger says the hammer that, you know, with the broken handle is an obstinate object. It's obstinate in the sense that it doesn't just let me get on with things with the hammering of the nail to hang the picture on the wall. And that obstinacy is a disruption, is of course a negative thing, but as I said just a minute ago, it's also a positive opportunity for us to say, so what does this tool do, or what is my relationship to the tool, or what do I do with obstinate tools? So it's useful, I guess, intellectually or reflectively, if you like. On the other question, are we going to be closer? This goes back to John's question a little bit. I mean, it is true that, you know, my glasses are the closest thing to my face, but they're not, you know, I'm not close to them in any sort of emotional sense. Whereas I'm very close to my parents, who live thousands of miles away from me. Will it bring us closer? I don't think so, except in the maybe very local sense that we will all one day hopefully see loved ones that we haven't seen for a long time, or we will all hopefully one day be allowed once again to go in a big group to a pub and hug and chat to our heart's content, and we will be much more appreciative of that. So it will bring us, if you like, possibly a renewed sense of appreciation. But I don't think, as a trade-off, it's a very good one. I don't think we need a pandemic to cultivate that sense of appreciation. There's other ways of achieving that.
Great, thank you. So our next question is from Jake Jackson. And he's interested in this idea of the loss of trust in others that you mentioned in the talk. And he asked, essentially, can you speak a little bit more about it? He says, I remember your work on bodily distrust, but now it seems more and more that we cannot trust others especially when they flaunt poor choices online?
Yeah. Okay, so I think what we're really seeing in the pandemic is that bodily doubt, or this conception I came up with of bodily doubt to describe the disruption of the normal, taken for granted trust I have in my body. You know, that I'll stay conscious, I'll be able to keep upright, I won't lose my capacity for speech and so on. I think you can see that sort of maybe amplified across a lot of life domains in in the pandemic, because all of a sudden you can't rely on anything. I mean, now people are saying the hospitals might be full. There won't be any hospital beds for people. You can't rely on your next door neighbor to give you the proverbial, you know, cup of sugar, because they might be passing the virus on to you at the same time. So it is true that there's been an incredible shattering of our sense of the very global, but also very tacit certainty and trust in the world. That can then be, you know, that you see kind of shards of it everywhere. We distrust other people. Some people distrust politicians. Some people distrust scientists. I mean, this is sort of, you know, party time for the anti-vaxxers who have this opportunity to plant, you know, more and more doubt in people's minds about what sort of vaccine will we be provided with, and should we take it. And I think what we're seeing possibly is a lot of polarization and a lot of extreme positions. And this is a very natural thing, because when you take people and put them in situations of great uncertainty and add stress and anxiety, nothing good is going to happen to interpersonal interaction. There will only be, you know, suspicion, worry, anxiety, concern, and then all the other stuff, blaming, criticizing, and so on. And I think that the heightened emotions that accompanied the big scandals, you know, the Cummings and so on, were really, I think, an expression of all of these kind of sentiments, and sense that nobody is really going to sort of keep all this together. And the fact that it's global, that we're seeing things go terribly wrong in almost every country, globally, with the exception of a few in Southeast Asia, is also compounding that sense that, you know, you can't even get on a plane and escape anywhere, because nowhere is COVID free. Well, maybe New Zealand, but yeah, the sense of distrust is, I think, as global as it could get.
Thank you. So here's a question from a different kind of perspective, I think. But so from German or German Molina, what is your phenomenological reflection about the relationship between humans and animals, and whether you know, what difference the pandemic might make to our relationship with other animals?
Well, I think the immediate picture that we all have in our heads is, you know, that bat that did or did not get eaten, or did not bite some other small mammal. I think what we will have with compounded distrust and uncertainty is also increasing distrust and uncertainty towards towards everything. So I think initially there was a stage when we all washed our shopping. At least we did in our house. We did that for a few months, and then we stopped doing it because it seemed a bit pointless. But I think that distrust might extend itself to kind of all walks of life. I don't know if there's a particular human animal aspect that has been changed. I don't know if you want to type in the chat and say more about what's kind of underlying your question. But I think all domains of life will be hugely changed. I haven't considered specifically the question of animals, other than, of course, this idea that we have to be very careful about what animals we eat and how we keep them, and how much of wilderness and open spaces we continue to take over at the potential expense of viruses species hopping.
Thank you. So here's now a question from Mark Kircher. In the talk you spoke of trauma. Mark wonders whether there's a sense of grief about the pandemic, a grief for the loss of futures that will not now come to pass. And Mark says, I feel haunted by futures that did not happen and now will not happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a fantastic way of cashing out what I was saying earlier about, we started out thinking, oh, this is an emergency just for a few weeks, just for a few months. And now, who knows? Maybe it's forever. Maybe we will live in a dystopian, socially distanced world for a long, long time to come. And yes, there are countless moments that we've all accumulated of lost opportunities, things we couldn't do or wouldn't do because of the pandemic. So this could be something trivial like your summer holiday, but it could also be big things. I think people put plans on hold. I presume lots of careers have been destroyed, of, you say, going back to people in the performing arts. There will certainly be a profound sense of grief that maybe older people feel, because they think, what if this is going to be how it is until my individual life ends? So maybe, kids think, oh, it'll just be something I'll look back on as, oh, this happened when I was 7. But for other people, I mean, the possibility of this stretching, maybe not indefinitely is a bit strong, but stretching considerably into the future is definitely a worrying thing. And I think if you think about how people died during lockdown in isolation and separated from their families, with people medics wearing PPE and not being able to communicate very well, that was in itself an enormous tragedy that happened to many thousands of people. And yes, I think in all of this there is a real sense of grief about this accumulation of all the good things and all the nice things and all the weddings and parties and graduations and all the other stuff that is starting to look like it might shape, the better part of people well, maybe not a generation, but people say the kids are doing GCSEs now, doing A levels. That's all been sort of taken away from them. So yeah, there is a real sense, I think, of grief, frustration, anger that is finding expression in all kinds of skeptical opinions, or again this polarization I was talking about earlier between people who think that we should just get on with life and let nature take its course, whatever that might mean, and people who are profoundly concerned about catching COVID or other people catching COVID. And we're just living in this impossible tension for, again, an unknown amount of time. So grief is a big component here, yes.
So we have a question here from John Davies, which is a kind of cross-cultural question, I guess, about phenomenology. So John asks whether looking at other ages and other cultures' practices of experience deprivation, such as monasticism or the lives of hermits, might have a bearing on the phenomenology of our situation today.
Yeah, that's super. I think that's a really creative approach to take here. I think, yes, I think the difference is that, say, people who choose to isolate themselves, such as hermits, do it through choice. And what I think happened here is that we've been exposed to this mass scale transformative experience, but it is not one any of us chose or could have chosen plausibly, rationally. So the sense of choice has been removed from that. So I think the analogy isn't isn't perfect here. I think it's one thing if you decide to deprive yourself in order, to live a life of frugality for spiritual reasons or religious reasons or whatever. That's one thing. But if you are just going about your daily business and all of a sudden you can't transact any of that daily business as you used to through no fault of your own, then I think that the sense of frustration, imposition, helplessness is much more profound in our own case. But it's a very useful contrast, I think, to draw, because it brings out this idea that we've had this radical change imposed on us. This is unchosen.
So we have a question here from somebody who only gave their initials, NB, and the question is again about whether a positive thing that we may learn from this experience of the disruption of things that we normally take for granted. And I think NB asks, could the destabilizing effect of the pandemic help us to understand people who already challenge those micro practices that we tend to take for granted, such as people with autism or even children who always question the why of it all?
Yeah, thanks very much. That's exactly right, I think. So what we're seeing here is the pandemic forcing us to change our social practices. And that leads us to say, oh, why did we used to do it like this? Now, of course, this is something that maybe neurodivergent individuals or small children are in that same position of having this distance from the social practice or the norm and saying, why are we doing it like this? So that, again, that what I think is the pandemic experience has in common with cases of some illness and some disability is precisely that it is an opportunity to question, because you are distanced from the routine, the habit, things as they normally are. And you might be distanced because of the pandemic, you might be distanced because you're a neurodivergent individual. And in both cases, it is the distance that allows us to question. It is the removal from the everyday fallenness, as Heidegger would say, that allows us to get a perspective and make that a reflective inquiry.
Okay, great, thank you. We're coming towards the end of our time now. We've only got a few minutes left. Here's a question which sort of comes back to something that we started with, really, but where we started with a more kind of ontological twist on this question, and I guess this is more a kind of, in a way, a therapeutic form of the question. Do you think that having advanced technology like smartphones and the internet during this pandemic makes it easier for people to cope when compared against past pandemics?
Well, I think you need a historian, but I mean, it seems kind of on the face of it that the answer is yes, of course. Being able to communicate and have long conversations with people, play games with people, hang out with people, watch films with people through technology is certainly better than nothing. But more broadly speaking, I mean, I think this issue, especially the smartphone technology, and I'm saying this as a very seasoned and slightly frustrated mother of a teenager, I think we're conducting a kind of social experiment on a mass scale, and we don't really understand what we're doing and how this is affecting us. So on the one hand, yes, this is incredibly useful to have the technology, but I think the idea that we can replace embodied modes of interaction with other people with technologically mediated ones is it's not a simple swap we can make. So I think it's helpful as a crutch, if you like, a social crutch in the short term, and maybe it's a longer term viable option for, say, meetings or philosophy talks or stuff like that. But at the end of the day, I'd be very surprised if this kind of technologically mediated interaction would ever be counted by people to be as good as or even better than the real thing. So yes, so I think the technology helps short term as a plaster, but I think this is again another opportunity for us to ask bigger questions about our life in the age of the smartphone, I think in particular.
Right, thank you very much, Javi, for that answer, and for all of your answers, and for your lecture this evening. It's certainly been very enlightening and a very wide-ranging set of questions. Thank you to everybody who's watching who has submitted questions. We have one more comment that came in the box that I have sent through, which I think will appear in a moment. This is from Dagger17, who says, as a philosophy student, one thing that's helping me navigate pandemic-induced isolation is being able to take part in online lectures that I would never have had the chance to attend in person. So thank you. And I think that's obviously exactly right. We've had people attending this lecture from all over the world who, had we held it in a lecture theatre in Cardiff University as we normally do, those people simply could not have attended at all. Okay, so I think how I would normally end one of these sessions is inviting everybody to applaud and thank our speaker, and I don't see why they shouldn't do so now. Thank you very much, Havi.
Thank you so much. Thank you for listening and watching.